Okay, hey, welcome to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have another awesome review for you, brought to you in part by Belmont Watches. We connected, and I'm able to feature a couple of their units that they currently have in stock for sale. This is from Kurono, Tokyo, and it is basically by Hajime Asaoka. And these are a made in Japan product. And basically it's a production line that runs kind of in parallel with Hajame's high-end handmade pieces that fetch, greater than 50K a lot of the times and involve really long wait times. These pieces can also involve some pretty decent wait times, but nothing in comparison. This whole kind of venture started because the kind of brand founder wanted to make a watch that he could wear instead of making watches for other folks, which he's amazing at. He wanted something that he could also wear because he was so busy making, filling orders for others. And that was kind of the design and inception of this particular watch. I'd consider this an everyday dress watch. Some key common characteristics in design language. You're looking for something that can be worn every day. On the dressy side, you're gonna want that clean, classic, minimalist design, and of course, sensibly sized, which this Mystic Gray example really does an amazing job of kind of nailing. This was actually part of the original first series of watches from Kurono Tokyo. And this is a pre-owned piece you can get at Belmont Watches for about $6,000. I think it's kind of a deal still, especially when you think about, the market for these watches. This is a 50-piece limited edition. There's 49 other watches, and then there's this one. And if you want them, the people who have them love them, and the folks that are willing to sell them understand the value around these timepieces. So I'm happy to share this with you, and I'm happy to have my hands on it because I've been on the lookout for one of these for myself for a very long time. And yeah, I'm glad I'm finally able to get some hands on with something that I've been kind of checking out for so long. So with that, let's zoom the camera out, get this piece in hand, and take a closer look. All right, guys, this thing is just, my goodness. Is perfection, is that overused? Because, really, what would you change about this piece? The scale, it's classic. It's 37 millimeters, and it honestly probably wears a little bit smaller because of the way that the dial brings your eye to the center of the dial. Although it doesn't really have a huge bezel, it is, a substantial bezel. And then it kind of, when you think about that outer track and then the inner concentric circles, it does, again, it squeezes the visuals down to a focused point versus it being, more of an all dial, spread out, let it breathe type of setup. Here, the action, oh my gosh, look at the light play on this. This thing is again, it's just perfection. Fully polished. The lugs themselves do taper down quite a bit, so it's a little thinner, not huge robust shoulders that are going to make this wear larger. So for me, of course, with about a 7.5-inch wrist or 7.25, depending on where on the above or below the wrist bone I'll wear something. Man, that thing is just, even on my wrist, although it does wear a little small, it looks amazing. And I enjoy it. Honestly, with the way that this is, I could see this being in like a 39 or a 40 and still being super, super wearable, just again, because of the way that the dial shrinks things in terms of the proportions. And yeah. Whew. Box dome sapphire, guys. Can't argue with that. You can see the kind of bubbled, that boxed edge plays off of the bezel as well. Everything is fully polished apart from the case back, which is fully brushed. And there's not much to it. It's solid, it's screw in, and you can see some nice etching there tells the story, and I do like that it does align, right? Like that's something like, wow, they did that on purpose. They made it to where you could read it as you held it and you spun it around, that it would be there. And yes, made in Japan, 3-bar water resistant, precision watch, Tokyo limited. I mean, this thing is sweet. The movement inside is very much a point of contention for a lot of folks. It is a non-glamorous Miyota 90S5. So no date movement, but this movement can also be found in watches around $300 or less. Does that mean that this watch is somehow $300 or less watch? I mean, you think about the Swiss ETA 2824, you can find that movement in watches around $300-400, and you can also find them in watches costing multiples of thousands. So there's always going to be some point of contention in a Japanese watch to have a Japanese movement with a nice smooth sweep on it. I think it's beautiful. It makes sense. And yeah, I mean, it's really hard to argue with it when you think about thematically, what were the other options there? I mean, what to have a thin, 4 hertz movement, what would the other choice be? It's tough. I think this is pretty much the right movement, and the reason why the prices have gone so much up is just because the people want these. It's supply and demand. They're not making enough for the people that want them, so the people that want them are willing to pay premium for them. So I mean, that's just how it is. If you just sold them really cheap, then you would just be making people mad because they would just be even more gone than they are now. So even as they've slowly kept to increase prices to make sure that the people buying them really want them and they're not just trying to flip them, the market continues to kind of rise. And this piece, man, it's just stunning. Very classic. I mean, just dress watch. I mean, this thing you could wear this to a wedding. This could be your wedding watch in a tuxedo, but it could also be, your work watch. And it's just, this thing is cool, man. And yes, it's not cheap, especially now, not in the aftermarket. It's not cheap, but this thing has got a story. It's got this provenance. There's just so much passion behind it. I can't help but be impressed by it. In terms of getting into some of the details, applied indices, very high polished. You get that gray sunray dial, curved hands, which are high polished, 3-bar or 30 meters of water resistance, 20 millimeter lugs, which means that this is going to be quite suitable on a number of straps. The black calfskin strap on here is very nice. It tapers down to about 16 millimeters. You get that fully high polished and milled tang buckle, which is great. The leather on here is super supple. My goodness. I mean, you don't have to break that in. You don't have to bend it. This is just very, I mean, it's just plush and creamy and almost, I don't know. I don't want to say this in a bad way, but it almost like, it reminds me of like foam, like, and not in a bad cheap way, but like more in like the foam inserts that you'll find in like really nice sneakers, how there's like different layers and stuff that just feels really nice and light. That's how this feels. Like, it doesn't feel light and stiff like a cardboard, like a cheap thing. It feels like performance oriented. Like this, I don't know, this thing is nice. The whatever formula that they're using for this leather to process it, whatever cut that they're using, I'm digging it. I'm very, very impressed. So with that said, let's actually get it on wrist and see how it wears. All right, guys, as you can see on my 7.5-inch wrist, this thing wears really beautifully, nice and low. Look at that, low slung. It's just doing what it's supposed to do. You could wear this with a long sleeve, short sleeve. It's extremely well suited, well dressed, but I think also versatile enough to be casually worn, just because it just has a certain element of play and visual interest and fun that it's packing. It's just a little bit different, and of course, it has beautiful mid-century lines that aren't going out of style ever. But man, this thing is just gorgeous. Look at the way the light dances off of those concentric circles. Really beautifully done. And again, lays just perfectly. And this is smaller than I would typically wear. I'm more of a 38. 38 and a half is kind of the sweet spot for something that doesn't really have, a dive time bezel on it. But this is really, really charming. And again, there's a certain level of just rarefied air that is going on, because of how scarce and how, the feeding frenzies around these pieces. To have that, it just gives you such a wonderful feeling. Like, it's just, you understand why people want this thing so much. I mean, could I pay these prices, the aftermarket prices? I haven't yet, but man, this thing makes a case for itself, I have to say. So with that said, let's get it off the wrist and do some low light transition, because there won't be any loom on this gorgeous dial. Okay, we'll go ahead and hit the lights here. And like I said, no loom, but I did want to get some low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself, coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath an overhang, maybe the shade of a tree, or just spending time in your favorite automobile. So it's good to see how these textures, finishes, colors render in less than optimal lighting. So these great mixed lighting conditions do give you a better idea of what your watch will look like when it's not in the middle of a studio. So I do even like to get into some very high contrast, unflattering, lighting here, which typically would expose any type of, factory defects or anything like that. But you can see this thing is just perfectly executed. I mean, my goodness, this dial, I like the play on it. It is, it's less busy. It just has that nice vibrant streak, and it has more of a high contrast flow where you're getting deep dark grays with, again, that really bright burst there, while other dials on this kind of sunray style can be a lot brighter and louder. This more subdued take, I think, really flows with the refined lines and shapes of the aesthetic here. So very, very handsome, guys. Closing thoughts on the wrist, it wears really nicely. Of course, it is on the smaller side, but it's compact with plenty of wrist presence though at the same time. So I like that. I like that even though it's small, it has large intentions. There's large amounts of excitement and visual interest in such a small package. And I appreciate that. In terms of model variants, there's various colors and dials that have been released since this initial run. In terms of comparable models, it's really tough to compare since this is such a niche piece, so I won't even try to. But you guys can definitely compare down in the comments below if you think that there's other stuff that compare well to this. And I'm sure there will be some that are more expensive. There will be some that will be cheaper. I should say probably a lot that will be cheaper, but I mean, none of them have nailed this aesthetic and owned this aesthetic the way that the Kurono Tokyo brand has. So bottom line here, guys, although the overwhelming aftermarket demand for these prices, for these pieces have caused prices to really almost overshadow the excellence of the product itself, I have to say, having it in hand, it's very apparent why so many folks have been committed to paying a premium for these. And then for those of you who don't hold on to pieces the way that I do, These are honestly some of the few independent micro brands that gain value right after the initial purchase, right? Like normally depreciation hits as soon as you buy it, it's worth less now it's used. Like the minute this thing is for sale and it's outside of that tiny window of availability that you get from the factory, from the, from the brand itself, these skyrocket. Um, and yeah, I mean, again, they're not cheap, but they don't feel cheap. They have a movement that is, I'd say, quite available, and some folks might find a bit pedestrian for something that is worth this much. But the same can be said for a lot of other examples as well. So, it's not like this brand is the first to ever do that. So, yes, from a purely subjective standpoint, these are highly valuable and highly lusted after. But from an objective perspective, this is not a cheap watch. So expecting it to be cheap really just doesn't align with reality. So with that said, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you like the video, please do hit like. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.